Who are we talking to next?
Let's take Nick in Tennessee.
Ooh, okay.
So Nick is calling in to ask if ending a life means causing it to suffer. And I'm pretty sure I know where this is going, but I'm willing to hear you out. Nick, welcome to the show.
Hey, how are y'all doing?
Doing good. You called in a couple of weeks ago, no?
Yeah.
Cool.
Rock on. Yeah, I'm coming down off of my rage over circles. So just
don't read the super chats until the end of the show and you'll be fine.
Oh no.
All right. Guys, if you want to see Eric's head explode, feel free to leave a very absurd circle related super chat.
Please don't. Oh God, please no.
Nick, what's your question today?
Yeah, so my question is just kind of about the general concept of minimizing suffering, right? If we say it's good to minimize suffering, and if that's the standard we use for judging like how we treat animals, whether we eat them or not, whether we farm them or not. My question is, does ending its life inherently mean that you caused it to suffer? And if so, would that be a wrong thing to do, or does it, because we euthanize some animals, right?
Right.
Oh.
I don't think that this might be one of those things that gets clipped and taken out of context. I don't think that ending a life inherently causes suffering. I would not be willing to grant that. I think the way in which you end the life would cause suffering. And I think that in some cases, what we should be focusing on is the life lived up until the point of death, which ultimately, to me, is the biggest issue when it comes to animal suffering, at least in cases of industrial farming complexes and how we run things in the U.S. But no, I would not be willing to grant off the bat that ending a life causes suffering.
Okay. Have you, Nick, have you heard of or read about Temple Grandin?
No, it's not ringing a bell.
Temple Grandin, really interesting story. What she did, she did a lot, but what I'm referencing here is she came up with a system of slaughtering cows humanely that would cause them to kind of go through these circular things so they wouldn't see what's coming, that, trying to as humanely slaughter them as possible. And if you're talking about killing, right, that's its own thing. But if you were to somehow, in theory, remove the suffering from the death, then I think it would be better. The conversation, I think, would be helped if it was is life preferable to death conversation. Because if you were able to remove the suffering, I bet you the conversation's not over, is it?
Correct. I think it's part of a larger conversation about just that, about the long-term care of the creatures and how you treat them up to that point of death.
Yeah.
And kind of the
sure,
I guess the implications of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So where are we going with this? Are you smuggling in veganism, Nick?
Smuggling?
Yeah.
He just came right out and said it.
Came right in? Okay. Oh, no. He's personally struggling with veganism.
Oh, right. I thought you said smuggling it.
I did say smuggling, but I like where Nick is going.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
There is an argument that I heard that I gotta admit kind of stuck with me, even though I would consider like not causing a creature to suffer before you kill it to be better than causing it to suffer before you kill it, if you had to eat the creature, because you got to eat something.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was Joe Rogan, but it may have been somebody else that said, like, if you hunt something and you manage to kill it in one shot or something, then its life ends very suddenly and relatively painlessly compared to getting mauled by a bear or stricken with disease or getting a broken limb and whatnot. Right. So, I got to admit, to me, that's a compelling point as to why it would be morally okay, because you're giving that thing, I guess, a death that's less painful. And that feels like a very messed up conclusion to arrive at.
Well, I mean, the concern there is that you could then just take that and apply it to anything, right? Like, oh, well, this person might die a horrible death, so let me just kill them now.
Yeah.
So like, I don't know if that's compelling, except for refuting a very specific argument that's, killing something always causes suffering, which I disagree with. So if that was the argument that was being refuted, good point. If that is an argument for how you should live your life, maybe avoid it. But yeah, I think we get into a problem with conversations around this topic because we can't quite pin down as a conversation more largely. Individuals, of course, can, but as a conversation more largely, I have not found a way to pin down exactly what the problem is with eating meat. Is it the killing? Because if that's the case, cool, we can have that conversation, right? Is it larger harm reduction and making sure that we are not factory farming animals before that point and reducing the suffering of their actual life? If that's the case, absolutely, let's have that conversation and tell me how I can help, right? If it's an environmental thing, hey, well, you know what? It's actually bad for the environment to do XYZ. Here are better ways to do that and reduce harm to not just those individual animals, but to the planet. Cool, let's have that conversation. But that conversation cannot go back to killing is bad, right? And so we have this kind of circle that we run through where it's like, okay, well, which piece of this do we want to talk about and break down and have issue with? And which parts are our personal moral feelings, because I don't want to discount those either. But making a case for the environment being harmed by factory farming does not get supported by the idea that death causes suffering, right? Those are two separate conversations.
Right.
So we can have whichever one of those conversations people want to have with us, but we need to make sure we're keeping that focus. And I love this conversation, Nick, because we got right down to it right away. Does, ending a life always cause suffering? I don't think so. Nick, I think you agree with me on that. So now what? Now what are we left with? What's the next step here?
All right. So this argument came to me as a refutation of my own point when I was arguing with my parents about the morality of God's actions in the Bible.
Okay.
And specifically regarding the flood. So when God killed all but 8 people, I inherently, just intrinsically, feel like that's bad.
Mm-hmm.
But if that brought them a relatively quick and painless suffering, as opposed to how their lives might have ended otherwise, then does that remove the moral wrongness of that evil from the action and mean that flooding the whole world was fine? And I don't like that thought at all.
Oh, okay, let's talk about suffering for a minute. Suffering is deeply related to fear and to the prolonged process of dying and seeing other people die. That is one of the things that is horrible about factory farming in many respects is the animals know what's about to happen. And that's terrifying, right? That is where the suffering comes into play. The actual act ends that suffering. So that suffering shouldn't happen in the first place. And having your entire world flooded and drowning and seeing your family drown is not a painless or quick way to go. If we're arguing, maybe a Thanos Snap possibly could be a better solution for an all-powerful God to immediately get rid of folks. But a global flood that not only killed the people, but all of everything, that doesn't feel like a more merciful way to go.
Well, and also I think that in that specific scenario, there is no merciful way. There is, period. There's not. The example that I would give is, let's say a forest fire is coming and in the barn, all the animals are tied up and there's no way to get them all out. Somebody could make an argument that putting them down before the fire got there would put them down less painfully than if the forest fire got there. Sure. And I think that if you were, having that conversation with your parents and that was kind of their argument, the problem is God set the forest fire.
Yeah.
God set the forest fire knowing and fully intending for that fire to get to the barn. And if that is the case, there is absolutely nothing that God can do that is moral or ethical, because literally all options lead to being that God's fault. It is not yeah.
I don't think, like, if I'm steel manning their position, right? Because, okay, you won't study this long enough to put this together. But from their perspective, God didn't start the fire, we did. God built the barn, we set it on fire. God flooded the world to put it out.
So,
from their perspective.
I love it.
And to V's point, if everyone dies and there's no one left to mourn them, like let's say the fear, the fleeing, the drowning process, 10 minutes of intense, like, worst thing in your life, suffering and pain, right? 10 minutes. But how long would those things have lived? How much work would they have had to done? How many times would they have been frightened or fearful or injured?
So are your parents also anti-natalists? Like, I feel like if they're going to take this argument, oh, well, their lives probably would have been full of fear and suffering anyway. Why are they, I'm assuming they're pro babies being born at all,
because they had you.
Like, if they are using that argument, they have to be consistent in that argument. And that argument gets them to anti-natalism, which is a belief that people should not be born or brought into this world at all. So, like, you can grant them that argument, but then take it to its logical conclusion, which is, so you don't think that life is good. So, like, you think that it is better to die than to live.
I think ultimately, yeah, that's the conclusion that my father and his family came to.
Wow.
Damn.
Like that, like, yeah, if you're not living for God, he's like, you're his. Yeah, I mean, even if you are living for him, you're his property to do it as he pleases. And if he's like, no, this one's
well, that's a fundamentally different.
Right,
that's a different argument entirely, isn't it? Like, there's a difference between saying, oh, well, it was just the most merciful thing that could possibly have happened, and that's why it's okay. Well, versus, oh, well, we're all just God's playthings, and God gets to do whatever he wants.
Yeah, if a God knew that that his creation was going to do all of these bad things, then the question is, could God have created those people to not do those bad things? When God created those people, the line usually is that God knew from the beginning that he would need to wipe out all of that life. And if you could change it and don't, you are still responsible. Or you're not all powerful.
Then you get into a conversation about free will that we probably don't have time for.
I actually don't think that falls into free will, because instead of talking about free will, what that has to do is God all-knowing? If God is all-knowing, then free will doesn't come into it. You don't even need to touch on it. Is God all-knowing?
Yeah,
then would God have known that these people?
Not necessarily.
No. So then their God isn't all-knowing, which is fine. There are plenty of people who think that. But
well, I don't want, like, there are limits to what I can assume about them for the purposes of this conversation and still making this particular argument.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
So I think ultimately, Nick, the actual dying process of the flood, right, drowning, maybe only 10 minutes, but Earth did not get flooded, allegedly, in 10 minutes, right? This wasn't a boom, you're dead situation. This was, like, it takes a long time for that to happen. And people had to experience everything leading up to those last 10 minutes, all of which was suffering. And so if you are going to take that argument and say that is merciful, then you have a really weird idea of what mercy is. And if we even grant all of that claim that your parents are making, that it was merciful, okay, fine, maybe it was only 10 minutes. Maybe it magically flooded in, 15 seconds and everyone just, died. In that case, you do have to take it to its logical conclusion and ask, why does anyone exist anyway if the most merciful thing is to not exist? So I would encourage you to have that conversation and ask them to take their claim to its logical conclusion and see how far they're willing to go. Because if they are willing to go all the way, then cool, that is their worldview. They are consistent in it. We don't have to give it another 2 seconds of thought, right? Okay, that's how you see the world. That is really weird, but okay. If they can't take it to that logical conclusion,
where's the disconnect?
There's a disconnect, exactly. Yeah. Where is that disconnect, and is that a conversation point that might be useful? So, yeah, those are my 2 cents.
I like those 2 cents.
Thank you. Nick, thank you so much for calling in. This was a really fun conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, glad to do it.
Cool.
For people in the chat or who may be watching this later, we could have talked about whether or not it was did the flood actually happen? And I know that that's a conversation that a lot of people want to have, but this was one about ethics and morality and utilizing the story that we both understand to have that conversation about theology, ethics, and morality is kind of the point of it. So for people who are saying, I just would have said that. No, we get it, but we're using this to talk about ethics. So yeah.